How's it going, Mike? It's really good to finally have you on the podcast. I feel like we scheduled this thing so long ago, but luckily I had the foresight of understanding that my kid was probably going to come in March. And so I booked off all of March. But I'm glad to finally have you.
Well, it's a pleasure being here, man. It's an honor, and congratulations on the newborn. That's pretty awesome. So it's great to be here, and it's great to be back from where I was back in December and November.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Mike, I start everyone off with their background, and the reason why I do that is because one, my audience may not be familiar with who you are somehow if they're living under a rock, right? And it also helps the people that are trying to do that career change into security so that they can hear the background. There's a variety of backgrounds. I've never heard the same backstory, of anyone. And so I feel like hearing that variety really helps my audience know that they can do it.
Oh, for sure. So a little bit about me. I got my start many moons ago with Gateway Computers. Actually, me and Jason Street worked in the same office in Houston for Gateway Computer Support. That didn't last very long for me. I wasn't very good with technical support for people that didn't have somewhat of a computer literacy or some sort of knowledge. So I moved to Segasoft Gaming and did beta testing for stuff like Rocket Jockey, which was really cool. So I was looking for glitches in software early on. I had messed with computers from an early age. My dad worked at the NSA when I was a kid. I was always into electronics, some sort of electronics. And so fast forward, I went to the military, became a signal intelligence analyst. Later on became a cyber warfare warrior for the Navy, one of the first in that rate. And in between, so got into a little bit of trouble with the FBI, opened up a couple can of worms here and there. And in 2016, had to come to Jesus meeting and worked for the FBI for a year as an informant. And then went to Europe thinking everything was good after that and got stuck because the State Department decided it would be a beneficial thing for the country to revoke my passport. So wow. I was basically exiled, for lack of better terms. And here I am today.
That's a wild journey. I mean, let's start from the beginning if we can, right? Like I don't want you to tell me anything that you shouldn't. I would prefer that the US government doesn't come knocking on my door. That would not be fun. How did you get into being a signals intelligence officer or analyst, whatever the title might have been? Because I imagine it's a pretty interesting field, and especially with the Chinese balloon that just, went over the country. There's a lot of mixed, I guess, feedback on it, right? A lot of people are saying, oh, it's a weather balloon, or, oh, it's not going to get anything different than what a satellite would, which, me being a security person, I mean, that's complete bullshit, right? Like complete bullshit, especially over the sites that it was flying over. There's no telling what it could have gathered, so like, how did you get started in that field?
So the funny thing is, my dad was also a ham radio operator, an amateur radio operator. And so he had a lot of that equipment around. I was really interested in electronics, like I said, from a super early age, like 8 years old. I really wanted to have things that beeped and had lights. So I got into radio and I got into ham radio. And so I figured that would be a good transition. I already had, some decent math skills, and I figured that I would go into something that had an intelligence rating. So 9/11 hit. And one of the things that I really pushed for was I wanted to go back in. I wanted to help the country, but with one caveat, I wanted to go into intelligence because I knew at that point in time when the last plane hit the tower, I knew at that point that intelligence and cybersecurity was going to be huge, because that's what caused that whole domino effect of events was lack of intelligence. And where intelligence is going today is the internet. So I pushed really hard for that. I scored really high on ASVAB, and went through the school and ended up getting stationed at the Joint Force Intelligence Command in Virginia.
Can you tell me anything about the school? Because, like, I always wondered if, like, that Edward Snowden movie was accurate, right? Where they sit them all down and they're like, oh, create a encrypted form of communication that cannot be broken, and you have like 2 hours to do it or something like that. Like, is that the kind of task that they would give you, or was it something completely different? It's worse. How does it get worse than that?
It's way worse, man. So one of the exercises that they do is they actually sit us behind these simulators, right? And they launch these simulated missiles towards where we're at. And we have to pick them up on the radar, bust them down by PRI and PRF telemetry, look at velocity, trajectory, and be able to tell when that missile, after we identify what missile it is going to hit the ship that we're on. And it's timed, and you have guys behind you yelling at you, look at this, look at that. And it's constant flow. And so the big joke, I never got stationed on a ship, but the big joke on the ship is when you see the CT swim team running for the deck, you should probably follow them over the side of the ship, because those guys see the stuff first.
Wow. That is, man, that's really interesting, like how they train their people. Did you get the sense that, the training was, top notch, top tier training? I would think that performing under that kind of, stress, it really ingrains those skills into you if you pass it. Did you feel the same?
I did. I felt like the equipment that we had might have been a little outdated, but some of the simulators that we had were pretty high tech. And it really, when you look at telemetry and when you look at RF and stuff like that, that doesn't change. So literally, some of the radios that they used back during World War II will still work today.
Oh wow!
May not be as secure, but that type of technology still works, and the theory, the antenna theory, and the telemetry and all that stuff still remains the same.
So to talk about a little bit more about signals intelligence, specifically with the Chinese spy balloon, right? I obviously know, like they can gather things from where they were doing it and all that sort of stuff, right? I don't know what things they could actually intercept and whatnot. The first objection that I would think of in my head is, well, aren't we using like technology from like the 60s in those missile bunkers, that isn't even connected to anything? It still runs off of a floppy. Like, how is that actually going to pick up anything that they don't already know? Can you talk about what it could potentially be picking up?
Absolutely. So the reason why it's going over the installations it was going over, I'm sure the payload included some sort of either video surveillance or some sort of imagery, analysis capability, right? On top of that, they probably had some sort of HF or UHF antennas, some sort of to pick up RF, right? So they go over these bases, and a lot of these bases were locations close to ICBMs. And so what they're doing is they're gathering all the telemetry they can within that area, not only to identify the ICBMs and the capabilities of those, which I'm sure they already know, but also to confirm other things, other points of interest. You may have a comms shack over here on part of the base, and they're going to pick up that telemetry and map that out. Sort of like we saw with Russia when they bombed the base that was close to the Polish border. The reason why they did that was because they were picking up telemetry and data, IMSI data from phones from that base that were UK-based IMSIs. So they knew that UK soldiers at some point were either at that base or were at that base currently. And so that's why they launched the attack on that base.
Interesting. Do you kind of see it as like a precursor for, potentially like a prolonged engagement even? And I think that you might be more qualified to actually talk about it, than anyone else I've ever had on, because of the time frame that you were serving. Like I didn't realize, obviously, like back then until fairly recently, that the first thing that we did when we went into Iraq, before we even put boots on the ground, was intercept all communications, shut down, power, water, sewage, all of that, right? And we were intercepting everything. So like there wasn't anything that we didn't know that was going on in the country. Um, do so do you take that experience and kind of map it to maybe what's going on right now in the world?
100%. I mean, I'd have to be like completely naive to think that it doesn't play a big part in what's going on. I mean, when you look at the ongoing engagement, let's roll back to when I was a contractor at USGFCom and I was doing computer network defense in the cell there. And one of the nights that I was working was the very first attack that I saw from Titan Rain, Operation Titan Rain, which was Chinese actors that were attacking U.S. military sites. And so that was my first interaction with the Chinese and that was back in 2003 or 4. That's all been declassified now. You can Wikipedia it. But starting from there and moving onward, right? So you saw all the insider threat espionage from China on the West Coast and all the tech firms, many years ago. And it's just a gradual effect. Then they switched over to healthcare, and you saw, during the pandemic, the Chinese in Houston at the medical center dumping and burning documents in their little embassy because they'd been found out. So it's an ongoing cat and mouse game, but let's not forget that the U.S. is engaged in that as well. We do the same things. We have a very robust espionage and clandestine intelligence agencies that really do top-notch and very technical type espionage and surveillance and collection. So we're very capable of doing the same thing.
Yeah, 100%. And I think I heard a quote right from it was in a book, I think by Andy Greenberg, where he was talking to one of these like black market hackers / dealer type of people, and he asked him like, would you ever sell a weapon that you would knowingly have intelligence that is going to be used against America? And the guy's response was actually, kind of eye opening to me, right? Is because he said, well, it depends on, where you're looking at it from, because to Iran, America's the bad guy. Well, maybe I'm a little bit more on that side of the spectrum. And so I agree with them. I can see how America would be bad, or Russia or China. And it's always interesting to me, just hearing about what we're actually doing, and what we're actually capable of doing. I have a friend in the Navy, and he does some stuff with the cyber department in the Navy. And I was talking to him about, going down this career path, right? This is years ago, like when I was in college and whatnot. And he said, the first couple of weeks are going to be like a culture shock, because the things that you think are impossible right now, that can't possibly exist, can't, possibly be penetrated. Like, they're going to tell you like, hey, we're breaking this via this tool, and it's going to blow your mind. And then after that, you're going to have to adjust to everything that's going on around you. Did that kind of happen to you as well when you got in and you started to learn about the capabilities and whatnot?
Well, so when I first got in, it was kind of weird because I kind of knew the capabilities already because I was so close. I was literally born at Walter Reed, right there next to NSA. Like that was my birth hospital. So I was kind of like attached to that whole type of, I guess, industry or that whole culture from an early age. My godfather was a linguist, a Russian linguist on a sub during the Cold War.
Wow.
So it wasn't weird for me. It wasn't a shock
Hmm.
going into it. What was really a shock was when I went into the military and I got the access, I got the clearance, and then started seeing the things that that access pertained to, and seeing the differences between what the media portrays and what's actually being conducted, and for what reasons. That's what was shocking. The rest of it was just kind of a transition. Same thing with going into cyber. I left the military and went directly into defense and cyber, and walked right into a fire pit because I walked right into Titan Rain like that same year. So I didn't really have a chance to sit down and go, "Wow, that was kind of a weird transition." To me, it was fast paced and just from one thing to the next.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how I guess it's interesting how the varying speeds can exist within the government, right? Just overall, right? Because I did a little bit of work with some agencies in the beginning of my career, and I mean, it would take them so long just to approve me to come on site, and I mean, it would be like a whole month ordeal, just for me to come on site, and then they were never ready, and it was a mess, right? And so when I hear from people like you that are saying like, "Oh, this is a fast-paced environment, and you're learning different things all the time," um, it's like I have to like reshift my thinking almost, because you were in a very different department and team than what I was experienced with, right? Like I was working with a very slow pace, slow environment. Not much is going to change with telecom, at an agency when you deploy in a VIA system or a Cisco system, it's not much is changing. But in your world, it would be rapid change. Would there be like knowledge dumps almost or intelligence briefs that get you up to speed on a regular basis, or how did you manage it?
Oh, every day there was a brief with the J6, that was the head of that directorate. Then we had the morning calls with the NSA, going over the different operations that were underway and what IOCs would look for. Um, as far as managing it, like again, even as a contractor, I still felt like I was in the military, and it was still that expectation, that fast paced. It's funny you bring up telecom because that was one of my first red teaming experiences, was breaking
Hmm.
into voice, because that breaking voice and intercepting voices is my specialty. And so I worked for Superior Viper Labs, and I helped create the distro. Well, actually wrote the distro Vast, which is all about voice interception.
Huh. Yeah, it's from my perspective, right? Like I I I managed or I handled at least a emergency, an E911 system, right? That would give enhanced information when someone would call 911. And me being the security mind that I am, I'm looking at the security of this system and I'm being told by my developers, by the engineers, like, oh, this passed, this military certification or whatever, so it has to be secure. And come to find out after you run the security stig that everyone wanted you to run, the whole app didn't even work. I mean, it was like it was insane. Like, guys, did you ever run this? Like, like, how did we pass this certification? And you claim it's still operable because, like, I have to make 50 more changes after I run this thing just to get it halfway functioning. And it was an interesting time because I feel like maybe even now, right? Telecom is kind of overlooked in terms of security. Like I know a CEO of a telecom company, and security's like really on the back burner almost, but that's a really sensitive place, that attackers can obviously get a foothold in and they would never know, right, that happened. And it's an easy way to glean intelligence. Do you think that that's true back then and today, or has it changed at all?
Oh, 100%. The attacks that we came up with at Superior Viper Labs, the Secret Service actually would come and watch our demos of our new attack tools.
Wow.
Because back then our focus was Cisco. Cisco was the most widely deployed voice technology on the planet. So we focus strictly on Cisco. Um, and if people really knew the vulnerabilities that were contained within the call manager and within the protocols and the way it's deployed, it would blow their mind. And not only that, but a VoIP packet, let's take a VoIP packet, for instance, right? A regular packet versus a VoIP packet, a data packet, right? So the VoIP packet, besides the header, besides the very first section, there's a lot of open space in a VoIP packet. And what can you do with that? You can take whole databases, chunk databases, put in VoIP packets, shuffle it out the door through port 5060 or whatever high port you want to use, and the person on the other end recompiles a whole database. And who here or listening to the podcast actually has IDS sensors or AI sensors on voice networks? Nobody.
Yeah, it's not something I even think about. Like that's wow. I never thought about it being exploited that way, which is interesting because I look at, I would look at the packets, I would look at the different traffic, and I just wasn't looking for that. It's a very it's an interesting mindset. Do you think that you found that mindset in the service where you're not looking at something for its utility necessarily? You're looking for the gaps. You're testing different things. Do you think that training kind of ingrains that into you? Because it's a whole different mentality, right? It's a whole different mindset. What you just mentioned right there, it's something completely different. Like I didn't even think of it,
Well, so like my mindset, and I talk about this a lot. My first speaking tour is called Inside the Mind of a Hacker. And in that I talk about, we're all born into this world as infants, as hackers. We're all hackers. We have to learn how to talk, walk, eat, all that stuff, right? So we're basically hacking our own environment. Some people lose that mindset as they get older, that child, imagination and challenge and that thinking, that out of the box thinking. Some people as they mature, some people lose that. I never seem to have lost that. I still have it. And I still want to take things apart. And I still want to see how things work. And I still want to see what I can create. And I think it's that mindset that really fosters, what I do now. The military really actually almost put a damper on that because it's very regimented. And it doesn't allow that outside the box thinking. This is how you're going to think. This is how you're going to react within these parameters, with these variables. And, with that equation, this is what the operation is going to look like. It's very black and white, which fed the other part of me because I'm neurodiverse. And so the black and white I get. And I thrived well in that environment because of the fact that it was black and white and I knew what to expect.
That's interesting. I always wondered about that, right? Because cyber is it's an evolving area. Everything can change in the blink of an eye. And, I would assume whole missions can be kind of thwarted just based on a reaction from an adversary that you didn't expect, that you didn't account for, that you didn't know maybe this kind of attack existed, right? And now you have to change everything, just someone on the outside that's never been in. To me, it's like, okay, it just makes sense that this would be more fluid, right? But that also breaks like military culture, right? And so that would be very difficult for them to kind of rationalize that, I could see. Yeah. It's
well, each person has their own job, and each person has been over that mission and been over their responsibility so many times in their head before that mission gets deployed. And so when you're in that scenario, it almost becomes like muscle memory, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's what I've heard too from other people that were in similar positions. So after the military, after intelligence work, right, where did you go from there? What did you start diving into? Because someone with that skill set, you could do great good, you could do great harm, like you have, the toolkit of both sides, right? Like What did you start engaging down? Because I would imagine it'd be pretty difficult, honestly, because you know what's out there, you know the capabilities that are out there. You may not even have access to those capabilities anymore, but you have that knowledge, you have that skill set. And so using that skill set and kind of, fanning the flame of curiosity would become extremely important, I would imagine.
Absolutely. So when I left the military, like I said, when I was in, there were some things that I didn't quite agree with. Uh, After I got out, there were things still continuing that I didn't agree with. And so I tend to find people with like minds. And I found those people, and those people ended up becoming a hacktivist group. And a lot of, like you said, good things and bad things came out of it, right? So I was maintaining a full time job. Like, let's take, for instance, Occupy Wall Street. I was actually working at Bank of America while working within a hacktivist group that was attacking Bank of America.
Oh, wow.
So I played both sides of the fence. It was like almost like a double agent, almost. Um, so I did that for a long time. When I was at Bank of America, that's when I knew that the FBI was not too far away. And so the investigation, I found out, went from somewhere between 2003 all the way to 2016. And that's when I had my meeting with the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's Office, Secret Service, and some other sharp people in suits in Houston. And that's when I became an informant for the FBI, working in a Russian APT group during the 2016 election.
Wow. I mean, it's like every 5 minutes you're saying something that like blows my mind. And it's like, all right, let's go down this rabbit hole. Right. So, when you're at Bank of America and you're working both sides of it, were you okay? So I guess this is a complicated question to ask, right? Were you giving the hacktivist group potentially like minor footholds or informing them, right, of minor footholds, like, oh, they don't have anything here, they don't have anything here, not giving them the keys to the kingdom, of course, right? But were you threading that needle, and how did you figure out how to do that?
So I was actually on the threat intelligence team.
Oh, wow.
Within the bank and on the corporate executive side. So I knew what they were looking for and what they were looking at. I don't know how much of what I did at Bank of America was actually in the stack of charges that the Department of Justice put in front of me. But I'm sure that some of that was in there. So I was, kind of relaying information. I still, I had contacts, active contacts and communicated back and forth on bank processes, stuff like that.
Oh, okay. Okay. That makes sense. So then, okay, in terms of the investigation timeline, right? 13 years. Is that basically like right when you got out of intelligence work in the military?
Yeah. And what's weird is when I left the military, I immediately ended up on a no-fly list for a short period of time, which was really shocking. I was like, wait a minute, I just left the military, we had a clearance, and then I go onto the no-fly list. But rewind back to when I was getting my clearance, and I was at Corey Station. I had some contacts in Russia that had sent me a letter. They were friends of mine and sent me a letter to the base, which was not very smart looking back in retrospect.
Yeah.
But I think that may have raised some red flags. And I think since then, they had kind of kept their eye on me pretty much.
Yeah, that would make sense because like they don't do that at least my outside understanding, right? They don't do that for everyone. As soon as they leave that sort of role, they're not actively investigating you. They're probably doing like some sort of psych evals and judgments of like, hey, what did he have access to? Do you think that he's potentially a flight risk or something like that? But I've never heard of that sort of reaction, I guess, right?
Yeah.
But even being put on the no-fly list, I mean, like even technically, right when you leave, you still have the clearance. It's just not active. You still have it for, was it like 5 years or something like that?
5 years, and after that you have to have like a corporate sponsor or somebody to sponsor it.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, the weirdest thing was like even after that, like after I got off the no-fly list, me and Chris Roberts actually used to compare boarding passes on Twitter, the 4S's, because it's supposed to be random, but for some reason it was not random for me. Every time I flew, I got the 4S's.
What's the 4S's?
Selective, security, screening, something. So it's a random, we're going to pull you aside and dump all your shit out and like look through all your stuff and figure out and ask you a bunch of questions and make sure you're not one of the bad guys that are looking for.
Oh, wow.
It's not random.
I didn't even realize that. I'm going to look next time when I fly, probably going to DEF CON, so I'll check it out then. Do you ever get nervous getting on a plane with a bunch of hackers going to DEF CON? It's like, all right, no one fuck around right now. All right. Like, I just want this thing to land safely. All right. You ever get nervous? Cause I do.
I don't get nervous in that aspect. Now if Chris is on the plane, if Chris Roberts is on the plane, yeah, I may try to catch a later flight. But other than that, no, not really. Last time I went to, when I went to Europe, one of the times I flew over on British Airways and was looking at the entertainment system and was just kind of like messing around with that network and watched all the TVs pixelate and freeze on the back of the headrest. And I thought, oh, wow, this is really cool. It actually does work. But nothing to the extent of what Chris did. And yeah, if Chris was on a plane, I'd probably try to get another flight.
Yeah. I mean, I'm surprised he could still fly. So... I had him on maybe 2 years ago at this point, and I try to bring it up because it's there's a New York Times article on it. Like, he did an interview on CNN about it and everything, and like he gave me like the silent like shut the fuck up. If
you want a screenshot. If you want a screenshot of the actual interview on CNN, let me know, because I have it on my phone.
Yeah, that's I don't know, man. That's just that I don't like flying to begin with, No. And so like, yes, like I know how to scan things, I know how to do various things, right? I'm nowhere near as skilled as a pen tester. I would literally not even call myself a script kiddie. Whatever's below that, that's what I'm at, right? I don't like flying by default. And so I really try my hardest to just focus on a movie when I'm flying, so I'm not freaking out. But Chris over there, he's like seeing how far he could take this thing.
And that's Chris for you. When I was on a flight to Europe, I was going over for my speaking tour, Inside the Mind of a Hacker. And I was doing my slides on the plane. And that's when I realized that my content and my topics that I speak on, I probably shouldn't do slides with other people around that can see it, because the next thing I got was a tap on the shoulder and said, "Are you still wanted by the FBI?"
Yeah, I could see how that would like scare the shit out of people at 35,000 feet, like doing that whole thing. Man, so after where were we? We were at Bank of America then you talked to the agencies and whatnot about their 13-year investigation, right?
Right.
That's an insanely long time to be investigating anything, I feel, right? Mm-hmm. I feel like the majority of their investigations close within a couple years, within 2-3 years, that's at least what I would think. Again, someone on the outside, I don't know what the hell any of that world is like or anything like that. I wanted to get into that world, and now I'm in a space where it's like, I don't know if that makes sense for me to go risk my life like that,
No.
So you're doing this work with the Russian APT group. Can we talk about that a little bit? Because The reason why I want to talk about it, right, is because that election is extremely controversial, right? And even when Trump was being, I guess looked at or whatever it might have been, right? Um, it seemed like one side was saying, "Oh no, that's completely incorrect, completely false. Russia wouldn't do that. They don't have the capabilities. The system isn't set up in that way for it to be vulnerable to that." And then we have, people that are coming out that in like completely manipulated social media. And I can't think of the company name right now, but I think it's still on Netflix. It's like The Greatest Hack or something like that, right?
Okay.
Where they hacked elections and literally manipulated social media around, false statements and just made things up to get people to win. Um, what was that like? What were you specifically working on? If you could
So
tell me.
you're sure, absolutely. You're speaking of you're speaking about Cambridge Analytica,
Yes.
and their work around the elections. So APT 28 was the group I was in before I was even an informant. The reason why, probably the only reason why I didn't go to jail is because I had that connection,
Hmm.
and I had a really good lawyer. My lawyer, David Adler, he's former CIA. You can look him up. He's a Houston lawyer, and he still does a lot of work for the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I think that had a lot to do with the way I was treated as well. Yeah, working as an informant was really interesting to begin with. I had to sign what's called an OIA, which is an
Hmm.
otherwise illegal activity form. So it's basically saying the FBI was saying, okay, we're going to have you do some illegal shit, but if you go outside these parameters, not only are we going to charge you for what we told you to do, but everything else that you did along the way. And I had to
Oh
sign
wow.
those like once. I had to sign those like once a month. Um, they would take me out to lunch, and I would give them what I had collected from the group, and then they would, sometimes they would give me money, sometimes they wouldn't. It was really a weird situation. At one point, at the very beginning, they wanted to give me a laptop because I told them I wasn't going to do this on my home computer. And they wanted to give me a laptop of theirs, and I said, no, just give me some money and I'll go buy my own. So from the very beginning, I was really careful with how I dealt with them, and with good reason. Because after I was done with my year as an informant, I contacted him, and it was about the election. Some of the questions I had, some of the sources I was looking at, wasn't really matching up with what I was hearing, what I was seeing. And after I contacted him about that, then they kind of ghosted me. And that's when I reached out to my lawyer and I said, I haven't heard from him. Am I good to go? And apparently, everybody thought I was good to go. Well, I get on a plane, and next thing I know, I'm stuck in Europe. So,
Huh. I mean, that's pretty wild, but it's not out of the realm of possibility, right? I mean,
right.
I guess if they don't want me in the country, right? The next time I go to Germany, they just revoke my passport, and guess what? I can't leave now.
Well, that's the method of operation for them, though. If you look at what they did with Snowden, same thing. He left to go to Singapore. As soon as he left, revoked passport. That's their method of operation. If they don't want somebody in the country, if they feel like somebody could pose some sort of, not necessarily a threat, but pose some sort of conflict,
Hmm.
then that's the easiest way to get rid of them. As soon as they leave, just revoke their passport.
So you think potentially, you had a different narrative than what was being told in the media, and they wanted to potentially make sure that you couldn't deliver that message in a credible way, even though you were probably the one that had the most credible information. You think that might have been what it was?
Well, I know for a fact that played a part in it. How much of it, I don't know. I do know that when I spoke in Egypt, so I was stranded in London, and I was invited by the Ministry of Defense in Cairo, Egypt, to actually speak at a conference there, their national cybersecurity conference in Cairo. And so I gave my talk, and they brought a laptop out to the podium so that I could see the crowd. And then my image was up on the big screen. And so I'm giving this talk in Cairo, and then immediately after the talk, you get a LinkedIn message from somebody from the State Department saying, "Hey, I just saw your talk. I'm here in Cairo. Let's go grab a beer." And I said, "Ha, joke's on you. I'm not in Cairo." So I know that carries over. I know that they still keep that information. I know they still want to kind of like keep an eye on things. And of course, I've had like former FBI and CIA on my podcast, so it's not like I'm trying to shy away from it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So, if we could circle back to the election, maybe the number one question that I get personally from people that are not in security is like, how is that even possible, right? Because these election systems aren't connected. In my mind, I don't know. I've never looked at it. I've never tried to look at election systems or anything, but at DEF CON, right, they have 10-year-olds up on stage and they breach these election machines within 30 seconds or whatever. So if a 10-year-old can do it, surely Russia could do it, right? Or they could do something more advanced and, potentially intercept the signals, right, around how it's being transmitted or counted or whatever it might be, right? Can you talk about maybe some of those attacks that you saw or that you knew that were going on or trying to be planned, anything like that?
Sure. So I can tell you that the real concern that they had was not the actual voting architecture, like the voting machines, actual voting process. The Department of Justice was more concerned about, I don't know if you remember, that was the same time frame as a DNC email leak.
Yeah.
They were more concerned about that than they were voting machines. My focus was not even on voting machines. My focus was on the operation to steal the DNC email database. And when it started pointing in a different direction as the source of the attack to be a domestic source, that's when things went cold.
Huh. Interesting. That is extremely interesting. Okay, so we're at 2016. Where do you go from there? I mean, how do you even scratch that itch anymore, right? Because I mean, at least in my mind, you're doing the coolest stuff out there. I couldn't even imagine trying to scratch that itch, right? Like once you're in that world, it's like impossible to do anything that compares, in my opinion.
Well, I went to work for an oil and gas company in Houston, and was traveling the world. I was going to Mexico, Singapore, Scotland, and luckily, I was still working for that company when the State Department revoked my passport. So I actually worked over there for an American company for a short period of time. But yeah, I still, I worked a 9-to-5 job. Same thing I did forever. I just tried to keep my background kind of quiet because I didn't know how people would take it. Once I got over to Europe and I got revoked and I started doing the public speaking actually started at Robert Gordon University. And a vendor for the company I was working for, he was one of our vendors for a security product, had heard my background and wanted to have me speak the next time I was going to be in Scotland. So I spoke in front of like 40 people at Robert Gordon University, and from there it just took off. Next thing I know, I'm speaking at like the Manchester United soccer stadiums. So
wow.
it really took off from there, and I started helping with the London Met Police and started doing mentoring for the kids who are on probation for cybercrime that had been, served time in prison. Started doing an intervention workshop with them. Became a board member of a couple companies in the UK. Things really took off once I got stranded over in the UK. I can't explain what happened and why. And then once I got back and started the podcast, it continued to roll.
Huh. How long were you stranded in the UK for?
It's hard for me to put that in a timeline because it's all kind of a blur, but somewhere between 3 and 4 years total.
Wow. Man, that's a really long time to not be able to come home,
Yeah.
especially when you intended to come home and you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, next month will be the month I get to go home. And, like, I mean, and even then it's like the bills keep coming in, like you
Mhm.
still got to pay the bills. Maybe you had a mortgage or whatever, like still got to pay those things, still got to take care of your family and whatnot. Like that's an incredibly difficult situation.
It's one of the most inhumane things I've ever seen our government do to anybody is to basically remove them from their own country and freeze their bank accounts because basically you're trying to kill that person. They can't,
Yeah.
they can't work in that country. How are they going to get money for food? You've frozen their bank accounts. They have no money now. What are they going to do?
Yeah, that's
But it's quiet.
right. I mean, what did I I don't understand the end game there, right? Because if let's assume, right, you knew something that they didn't want out in the media that was being perpetrated, by the right or the left, and they didn't want someone to validate it, right? Don't you think they should just leave that person alone? I mean, why would you push them to that place, right? Because it's only going to me, like if I was in that situation and that happens to me, I mean, it's like, okay, now it's fair game. Like, because you've cut me off, you've basically metaphorically killed me, right? So now I'm just going to dump all that I know, and you're going to kill me, and we'll be good. Like at least that's my self-destructive side mentality of it, right? Like, I'm sure after I sleep on it, I would rethink things, but
So I'll give you something to think about. So think about this for a second. If you weren't vocal about what happened to you, do you think it would be easier or harder to get rid of you? If you're vocal and you're constantly telling people about what happened and this is what the government did to me and this is what they're doing to other people now and constantly banging that drum, you become a voice for that. It's harder to take out that voice than it is someone who's super quiet and not known.
It's a good point.
One of the best pieces of advice I got was from a former agent, and he said, "Just keep speaking the truth. Just keep speaking, and they'll never mess with you again."
So, did you start your podcast when you were still over in the UK, or when you came back, you started it?
So when I came back, I was living with a good friend of mine from high school in Alabama, and we lived on a mountain. We had no neighbors. It was like out in the middle of nowhere. And we were just sitting around the bar one night in the house and drinking a glass of bourbon and started talking about, podcasts. Because I'm a big fan of Joe Rogan. He likes Tom Segura and Two Bears, One Cave or whatever. So we were talking about podcasts. And he's like, you have an awesome story, but more people need to hear it. Like, you're not getting it out there. Like, people need to know what happened. Not just because of the fact that, what they did to you by leaving you in Europe, but the fact that you're a veteran, a disabled veteran.
Yeah.
So we did like a short podcast. The first one was like me just talking, right? And it went from that. We had a live podcast, was probably like 50 people, I think, the first podcast. And it went from that to bringing in a couple guests at a time. And then my podcast went from 4-hour long podcast to now they're like an hour. But I was doing 4-hour podcasts, doing questions and answers, and I was just a machine when I first got back.
Wow.
But it was therapy for me. It helped me like get acclimated back to the U.S. Post pandemic, because when I left, the pandemic hadn't hit here yet. So it was a total culture shock, and then just the environmental shock going from London to on the top of a mountain, Alabama. So it took some time, but with that podcast, it was really therapeutic for me.
Huh. Yeah, man, doing a 4-hour podcast. I mean, I couldn't even imagine. Now I'm contemplating, doing like a 2-hour roundtable podcast, right? Having a couple different people and just talking about different things. I
I did a
just,
24-hour podcast.
good
I did
Lord.
my first the Haunted Hacker podcast first anniversary show. I had Jack Scott on and a bunch of other people. Um, Murphy, Mr. Murphy, Captain Zap. We had him on, but it literally was all nearly 24 hours. I had people staying up with me all night, and I kept the podcast going.
That is wild. That really is wild. So you actually started it pretty close to 2020 with COVID and everything like that. I started this podcast in 2021. I wish I would have just done it in 2020. I would have gotten probably a lot more traction. I wonder what that would have been like, right? How what are some of the challenges of podcasting that you have faced that, other people probably don't even think about or know that they're challenges? Like I can rattle them off, right? But it's different when someone, that has a even larger podcast than mine, someone as experienced as you, facing these different challenges.
Well, dude, I'll tell you what, like, to be honest, like the only challenges I had from the beginning was involving other people.
Hmm.
I'll be brutally honest and just really transparent here. Podcasting to me is super selfish because I do it because I want to talk to interesting people. I don't do it to make somebody happy over here. I do it because I enjoy what I do, and these people become friends of mine if I don't know them. But the only hurdles I've ever had was involving other people and just technology failures. Zoom is not been known to be the greatest platform for podcasting, but
Yeah.
it's my go-to. But I make it work. It's a really cheap podcast. It's very like unprofessional, but I think that's why people like it, is because it's just genuine. I don't hold anything back. I don't sugarcoat anything. I don't worry about censoring things that are said, stuff like that.
Yeah, I try to have that same mentality, and I feel like that mentality is kind of lacking in the industry. Like I hear different podcasts and they're like heavily edited. They're really scripted almost. I have no notes, right? Going into this thing, like I looked at your LinkedIn for 5 minutes, and I'm more interested in having a good conversation with someone. I'm more interested in getting to know someone, and maybe somewhere down the line, we're at DEF CON at the same time. It's like, hey, Mike, you want to go have a drink? Like let's hang out for a little bit, something like that, right? I'm much more interested in the relationships.
Exactly. I think the most important
to
part
me,
of podcasting for me,
beneficial,
is just
right?
being
For
able
other
to
people to hear those conversations and go from there,
Oh yeah. One of the most important parts for me about podcasting is just making that connection and creating that friendship, because, I've worked with Black Girls Hack. I've had them on my podcast, several different groups. That's how I met Alyssa Knight. I had her on my podcast. Just making that connection. It's the human element that really makes the podcast what it is. And if you take a look at the most successful podcast on the planet, Joe Rogan, his JRE, his Joe Rogan Experience, it is so genuine and so raw.
Mm-hmm.
And they're themselves. There's no script. There's no, hey, we're going to talk about only this topic today. We're going to see where the shit goes. That's the same approach I take. It's like having a glass of bourbon with somebody and just sitting there shooting shit.
Yeah, I think my audience, I feel like they really appreciate that free flow form, right? Like I had no clue that you did signals intelligence. I had no clue that we were going to talk about the Chinese spy balloon. I mean, I didn't even think about that thing in probably a week, right? Like, why did that come into my mind? I don't know, but it's probably perfect timing, right? Like who better to talk to about it, and now I get to tell my audience about it, like it's interesting. It's like almost a lost art that's coming back, just having a conversation with someone, not having a script. I mean, like I'm terrible with scripts. I used to have a co-host and he would like try to script out questions and, plot where the episode's going to go. And, we'd have fantastic episodes, But at the end of it, he'd ask me, hey, did you look at any of the script or anything? I'm like, dude, no, I didn't, man. Like, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to be anything other than genuine. I don't know how to be anything other than who I am. If I have a question that comes to mind, I'm probably going to ask it,
Exactly. And that's where I expect people who are interviewing me to be. It's all about getting to know that person. I can teach anybody. I could teach a monkey at the zoo how to do cybersecurity, right? It's not rocket science, right? It's a matter of this plus this equals this. Everything's a variable into an equation. So I can teach that. But what I can't teach is interpersonal skills and be able to communicate with people. And it seems like some of the young analysts that I'm getting, so I run a MDR, like a mitigate, detect, and respond, like SOC, with some younger people that are fresh out of college, and it's a different culture now, I think, and that communication is key. But teaching that at that age is really hard. But I think the podcast really helps to give kind of an example of this is how you're supposed to communicate. This is the lost art. I know you've been stuck in TikTok, since you're a teenager, and now that you're an adult, let's communicate like humans.
Right. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you coming on, and I'm very strict with my time, because when I say that my episode's an hour long, I don't want to hold my guests beyond that. I know that we all have busy schedules. So before I let you go, how about you tell my audience, where they can find you, what your podcast is, The Haunted Hacker, and anywhere else, that you may want to direct my audience.
Sure. You could find my podcast, the video version, on YouTube under Haunted Hacker Podcast. It's also on Spotify, Audible, iTunes, etc., Pandora, those Audible streaming services. Also, thehauntedhacker.com, the website, and also I have a 501(c)(3) Hackers for Vets. So if you want to help support bringing a person from active duty service into cybersecurity and help them make that costly transition, by all means, contact me and let's get rolling on that.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Mike. I really appreciate you coming on. This was a fantastic conversation. I definitely want to have you back on.
Absolutely. I'll be here. Just let me know.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode.